stun gun theory, risk assessment, and criminal logic. We've examined the undisturbed bed and what it tells us about the collapse of the stun weapon theory from one angle. But now we need to step back and look at this theory through a wider lens, not just asking whether the evidence supports it, but asking whether the theory itself makes sense when we consider what it would actually require someone to do. Because here's what sits quietly beneath this narrative, waiting to be noticed. If we follow the stun weapon theory to its logical conclusion, if we trace through what it would mean in practice rather than an abstract possibility, we find ourselves asked to believe in a series of decisions so risky, so improbable, so fundamentally at odds with how people actually behave when trying to avoid detection, that the theory begins to feel less like explanation and more like misdirection. Not intentional misdirection necessarily, but the kind of narrative that emerges when we need to fill gaps in plausibility without fully thinking through what we're claiming actually occurred. Let's establish what the stun weapon theory requires us to accept. Someone enters a house in the middle of the night. The family is home, asleep on the floor directly above where this person is moving. The master bedroom is close enough that normal household sounds could potentially be heard. In this context, this person supposedly believes that deploying an electrical device, a device that creates sound, that causes involuntary vocalization from the person it's used on, that risks waking not just the child but anyone within earshot, is their best strategy for maintaining stealth and control. From a criminological perspective, we need to ask ourselves, is this actually how people think when they're trying to avoid detection? Is this the kind of risk calculation that makes sense when your primary goal is to accomplish something without alerting the people sleeping one floor above you? Theme 1. The noise problem. Why sound defeats the theory's purpose. When we think about stealth, about moving through a space without alerting others to our presence, we think about silence. From a physiological perspective, the human auditory system is remarkably sensitive, especially during sleep. We're wired to detect anomalous sounds, noises that don't fit the normal acoustic pattern of our environment. A stun weapon, when deployed, creates multiple sound signatures. There's the electrical discharge itself, a crackling, buzzing sound. There's the sound of impact if it's pressed against a body. And, most significantly, there's the involuntary vocalization that typically accompanies the intense pain and muscle contraction the device causes. We're asked to believe that someone trying to maintain stealth, trying to keep a household from waking, would choose a method that virtually guarantees creating multiple unexpected sounds in the middle of the night. Let's think about the layout of that house and what it means for sound transmission. The children's bedrooms were on the second floor. The master bedroom was also on the second floor, separated from the children's rooms by hallway space, but not by significant distance. From an architectural standpoint, sound travels through houses, especially older houses with wood construction. A child's cry, a sudden vocalization of pain or fear, the distinctive crackle of electrical discharge. These are exactly the kinds of sounds that would penetrate walls and doors, that would wake light sleepers, that would prompt parents to investigate. So we're asked to believe that someone whose entire plan supposedly depended on not alerting the household chose a method that would create precisely the kinds of sounds most likely to trigger parental response. The theory requires us to accept a fundamental contradiction. Someone who needed stealth chose a method that defeats stealth. From a psychological perspective, let's consider what it would mean to deploy such a device in that context. The person would need to believe that the sounds created, the discharge, the child's involuntary response, would somehow not carry through the house. They would need to believe that parents sleeping nearby wouldn't hear their child's cry of pain, wouldn't investigate unusual sounds coming from the child's bedroom area. This level of confidence in acoustic isolation, in a wood frame house with a family sleeping nearby, strains credulity. Most people who have lived in houses know how sound carries, how a child's cry in the night reaches parents' ears no matter how many walls separate them. The theory asks us to believe that someone planning something terrible had failed to understand this basic reality of domestic architecture, or had calculated that the risk was worth taking. Neither explanation sits comfortably with the rest of the narrative. Now let's consider the alternatives that would have been available to anyone actually prioritizing stealth. From a criminological standpoint, if you need to ensure a child's silence and you're trying to avoid detection, there are methods that don't involve creating noise, methods that, while terrible to contemplate, would at least be consistent with someone thinking through their actions strategically. A hand over the mouth to prevent vocalization. Physical restraint that limits movement and sound production. Even chemical methods, if we're considering someone with premeditation and planning. All of these approaches, disturbing as they are to consider, would make more sense from a risk management perspective than deploying a device designed to cause pain intense enough to trigger involuntary vocalization. The fact that the theory points us toward the highest noise option rather than quieter alternatives should make us pause and ask, does this theory actually describe what would happen? Or does it describe what someone needed us to believe happened? From an anthropological lens, we need to understand that different cultures and different criminal contexts develop different norms around stealth and detection avoidance. But across all contexts, across all criminal archetypes, there's a consistent principle. You don't make noise when silence is what keeps you safe. Bank robbers don't set off alarms they could avoid. Home invaders don't create disturbances that alert occupants when they're trying to move through spaces undetected. The universality of this principle, minimize noise when detection equals failure, makes the stun weapon theory feel anomalous. It requires us to believe in someone who understood they needed stealth, but then chose a method that generated exactly what they were trying to avoid. That contradiction sits at the heart of why this theory feels less like explanation and more like narrative construction, designed to fill a gap without fully considering whether the fill makes logical sense. Let's shift to the philosophical implications of noise in the context of this case. Sound is evidence. It travels, it carries, it creates witnesses, even when visual witnesses aren't present. The neighbor who reported hearing a scream understood this instinctively. Sound that carries outside the house certainly carries within it. So, if we're asked to believe someone deployed a device that creates sound in a house where silence was essential, we're being asked to believe they either didn't understand this basic reality or didn't care about it. From a logical perspective, Both possibilities create problems for the theory. If they didn't understand it, they weren't sophisticated enough to be using specialized devices. If they didn't care about it, they weren't actually trying to maintain the stealth the theory says was their primary goal. Either way, we're left with a theory that collapses under the weight of its own contradictions. From a physiological standpoint, we need to think about what sound actually does to sleeping households. Parents, especially mothers, are neurologically attuned to their children's distress vocalizations. Research shows that parental brains respond to their own child's cry even during sleep, often waking to investigate sounds that wouldn't rouse them in other contexts. This heightened sensitivity to child distress is evolutionary, hardwired, operating below conscious awareness. So, the theory asks us to believe that someone deployed a device that would almost certainly cause the child to vocalize pain or fear in a house where parents were sleeping nearby with brains evolutionarily designed to wake in response to exactly that kind of sound. The more we understand about how parental auditory systems work during sleep, the less plausible it becomes that someone would choose a method virtually guaranteed to trigger those systems. So when we step back and consider the noise problem, the sounds a stun device creates, the involuntary vocalizations it would trigger, the proximity of sleeping parents whose brains are wired to detect child distress, we see a theory that requires us to accept a series of improbabilities stacked upon each other. From every analytical perspective, logical, philosophical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, and criminological, the decision to use a device that creates noise in a context where noise equals discovery doesn't align with someone actually trying to avoid detection. It aligns with something else entirely, perhaps with a narrative that needed to explain certain marks without fully thinking through whether the explanation made tactical sense. The noise problem doesn't just create doubt about the stun weapon theory. It fundamentally undermines the theory's internal logic, leaving us to wonder what we're really being asked to believe and why that belief requires us to set aside everything we know about how sound works in houses and how people actually behave when they're trying not to be discovered. Theme 2. The amateur versus professional paradox. We've examined the noise problem, and now we need to confront another fundamental inconsistency in the stun weapon theory. It requires us to believe in someone who was simultaneously sophisticated enough to acquire and deploy specialized devices, yet naive enough to use them in ways that dramatically increased their risk of discovery. From a criminological perspective, this creates what we might call the expertise paradox. The theory requires criminal sophistication in some areas but incompetence in others, and the pattern of which skills are present and which are absent doesn't align with any known criminal archetype. We need to ask ourselves, what kind of person are we actually being asked to believe in here? Let's start with what the possession of a stun device would require. These aren't items you casually acquire or happen to have lying around. From a logical perspective, obtaining such a device suggests forethought, planning, awareness that you might need an incapacitation tool. It suggests someone who thought through what they would need to accomplish their goals and took steps to acquire the necessary equipment. This is the hallmark of professional criminals or highly organized offenders, people who plan, who prepare, who think through contingencies and acquire tools accordingly. But here's where the paradox emerges. Professional criminals, precisely because they plan carefully, understand risk assessment. They understand that every choice involves trade-offs between capability and exposure. And they almost universally understand that noise in a populated house equals discovery equals mission failure. From a psychological perspective, let's think about the mindset of someone who would acquire a stun device for this purpose. They would need to believe that such a device was necessary, that they couldn't accomplish their goals through simpler means. This suggests a level of concern about control, about the possibility of resistance, that implies careful thinking about what might go wrong. But if they're thinking carefully enough to anticipate resistance and acquire tools to manage it, wouldn't they also think carefully about the acoustic problems those tools create? The theory requires us to believe in someone whose planning is detailed enough to include specialized equipment acquisition, but not detailed enough to consider the sounds that equipment makes. This uneven distribution of sophistication, present in some aspects of planning, absent in others, doesn't match patterns we see in actual criminal behavior. Now let's consider what the alternative explanation might be. That the person was an amateur, someone without criminal sophistication, someone who didn't fully think through the implications of their choices. From a criminological standpoint, this seems more plausible in some ways. Amateurs do make mistakes that professionals wouldn't. They do overlook risks that experienced criminals would immediately recognize. But here's the problem. Amateurs don't typically possess specialized devices like stun weapons. The acquisition itself suggests a level of preparation and forethought inconsistent with amateur spontaneity. So we're caught in a logical bind. The possession of the device suggests planning, but the deployment pattern suggests lack of planning. We're asked to believe in someone who was thoughtful enough to acquire specialized equipment, but not thoughtful enough to consider whether using it made sense in the specific context. From an anthropological lens, we can examine how different types of criminals approach similar scenarios and what patterns emerge across cases. Professional criminals who target homes typically do so when occupants are away. They understand that populated houses create exponentially higher risk. When they must operate in occupied houses, they typically use methods that minimize detection risk. They move quietly. They avoid confrontation. They certainly don't deploy devices that create sound. Amateur criminals, by contrast, often do create noise, but usually because they didn't plan ahead, because they got surprised by circumstances, because they're reactive rather than proactive. The stun weapon theory asks us to believe in someone who doesn't fit either pattern, not professional enough to understand why the device created unacceptable risk, not amateur enough to have simply failed to plan ahead and been forced to improvise. We're asked to believe in a criminal archetype that doesn't actually exist in the patterns documented across thousands of similar cases. Let's shift to the philosophical implications of this paradox. When a theory requires us to believe in behaviors that don't align with any known pattern of human decision-making, when it requires us to accept contradictions between sophistication and naivety that don't coexist in real psychology, we need to ask ourselves, is this theory describing what happened? Or is it describing what someone needs us to believe happened? From a logical perspective, The stun weapon theory serves a narrative function. It provides a mechanism for how someone unknown could have gained control. But when we examine that mechanism closely, when we assess whether it actually makes sense, given what we know about criminal behavior, risk assessment, and human decision-making under pressure, it begins to feel less like explanation and more like gap-filling. Not necessarily dishonest gap-filling, but the kind of theorizing that happens when we need an answer and grasp at possibilities without fully vetting whether those possibilities align with how humans actually behave. From a physiological perspective, we need to think about stress and decision-making. People under extreme stress, whether criminal stress from attempting something illegal or personal stress from processing trauma, don't suddenly become sophisticated in areas where they lack expertise. If someone wasn't trained in tactical deployment of incapacitation devices, if they hadn't practiced stealth in occupied buildings, if they didn't have the psychological constitution that allows for calm risk assessment during high-stress scenarios, they wouldn't suddenly manifest those capabilities in the moment. The theory asks us to believe that someone had the sophistication to acquire and deploy specialized equipment, but not the sophistication to recognize the risks that deployment created. This kind of partial competence, expert in acquisition, amateur in deployment, doesn't align with how skill and expertise actually work in human psychology. So when we consider the amateur versus professional paradox, the strange mixture of sophistication and incompetence the theory requires, we see another layer of implausibility stacked upon the noise problem we've already examined. From every analytical perspective, logical, philosophical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, and criminological, the theory asks us to believe in a criminal actor who doesn't match any pattern we actually see in criminal behavior. They're too sophisticated in some ways, too naive in others, with the distribution of competence falling exactly in the pattern that would be necessary to make the theory work, rather than in any pattern that would emerge from actual criminal psychology. This doesn't prove the theory is wrong, necessarily, but it should make us ask, why does this theory require us to believe in a type of person who doesn't exist in any documented criminal patterns? And what might that tell us about whether this theory is describing reality or constructing explanation? Theme 3. The geography of risk. Why location undermines motive. We've examined noise problems and the expertise paradox, and now we need to confront perhaps the most fundamental issue with the stun weapon theory, the sheer geographic risk it requires someone to have accepted. We're asked to believe that someone entered a house, ascended to the second floor where the family slept, entered a child's bedroom, and deployed a device that creates sound and causes vocalization, all while parents slept in a nearby bedroom with the neurological wiring to wake at child distress sounds. From a risk assessment perspective, every element of this scenario compounds the probability of discovery. And when we map the distances involved, when we understand the acoustic properties of that house's architecture, the theory requires us to believe in someone who either profoundly misunderstood their risk or simply didn't care about it. Neither explanation sits comfortably with the rest of what we're asked to believe. Let's start with the basic geography. The children's bedrooms were on the second floor. The master bedroom was also on the second floor, connected by hallway. From an architectural standpoint, we're not talking about a mansion where separate wings create acoustic isolation. We're talking about a family home where bedrooms shared proximity, where sounds from one room could reasonably travel to others, where parents could hear if a child called out in the night. Now, from a criminological perspective, if you're planning to do something that might create sound, might cause a child to vocalize, every additional foot of distance you can create between yourself and potential witnesses becomes valuable. Taking someone from a second-floor bedroom right next to where parents sleep is perhaps the highest risk scenario imaginable. The logical alternative, if you must take someone, if you must deploy devices that create sound, would be to move them to a different location first, somewhere more isolated from potential witnesses, before deploying anything that creates noise. From a psychological standpoint, let's think about fear and its role in decision-making. If someone was genuinely afraid of being discovered, if avoiding detection was truly their primary concern, they would be hyper-aware of proximity to others. Every decision would be filtered through the question: will this create sound that reaches the parents? Will this risk waking the household? Fear sharpens attention to exactly these kinds of details. It makes us cautious, conservative in our risk-taking, inclined to minimize exposure rather than maximize it. So, the theory asks us to believe that someone motivated primarily by fear of discovery made the choice to create noise in the location most likely to result in discovery, directly adjacent to where parents slept. This reverses the normal relationship between fear and caution. It requires us to believe in someone whose fear didn't sharpen their judgment, but somehow disabled it. Now let's consider what this means if we follow the theory's logic about who this person was. If they were sophisticated enough to plan ahead, to acquire devices, to think through how to gain control, wouldn't that same sophistication extend to understanding spatial risk? From a logical perspective, someone capable of planning the acquisition of specialized equipment should be capable of understanding that deploying that equipment next to sleeping parents creates unacceptable exposure. The geographic risk problem compounds the expertise paradox we examined earlier. We're not just asked to believe in someone who was sophisticated in acquisition, but naive in deployment. We're asked to believe in someone who understood enough to plan ahead, but not enough to recognize that where they deployed their plan dramatically increased their risk of immediate failure. From an anthropological lens, we can look at how criminals across cultures and contexts handle the problem of witnesses. The pattern is remarkably consistent. You create distance between your actions and potential witnesses. You move victims away from occupied areas before doing things that might create sound. You choose locations that maximize your ability to control the environment and minimize the chance that someone nearby will hear and investigate. This isn't sophisticated criminal expertise. It's basic survival instinct, the kind of logic that operates even in the most amateur criminals. So, when a theory requires us to believe someone violated this basic principle, that they chose the highest risk location rather than seeking a lower risk alternative, we need to ask ourselves whether the theory is describing actual human behavior, or whether it's describing something constructed without full consideration of how humans actually assess and manage risk. Let's shift to the philosophical implications of geographic risk in this case. The house itself becomes evidence, its layout, its acoustic properties, the distances between rooms. When we map these physical realities against the theory we're asked to believe, we see how much the theory requires us to set aside. We have to ignore that sound travels. We have to ignore that parents waked child. Distress. We have to ignore that risk compounds with proximity. We have to believe that someone made every choice in the pattern most likely to result in discovery, despite supposedly being motivated primarily by avoiding discovery. At some point, the number of things we must ignore or explain away becomes itself significant. From a logical, investigative perspective, when a theory requires us to set aside too many basic realities, when it requires too many improbable choices stacked upon each other, we should at least consider the possibility that the theory isn't describing what happened, but rather filling a gap with an explanation that wasn't fully thought through. From a physiological standpoint, we need to think about how proximity affects stress and behavior. Being close to potential witnesses, knowing that parents are sleeping mere feet away, creates acute psychological pressure. Heart rate elevates, adrenaline increases, the body's stress response heightens. In this state, people become even more attuned to risk, even more conservative in their choices, even more inclined to minimize anything that might create detection. The theory asks us to believe that someone in this heightened state of awareness, with their stress response telling them danger is immediate and proximate, chose to do the one thing most likely to trigger discovery: create sound that would wake the parents sleeping nearby. This reverses everything we know about how stress affects decision-making. It requires us to believe that fear somehow made someone less cautious rather than more cautious, that proximity to witnesses somehow made them take more risks rather than fewer. So when we consider the geography of risk, the proximity of the master bedroom, the acoustic properties of the house, the distances involved, the compound probability of discovery that every element of the theory requires, we see the final layer of implausibility in a theory already strained by noise problems and expertise paradoxes. From every analytical perspective, logical, philosophical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, and criminological, the geographic risk assessment undermines the theory's claim to describe actual behavior. We're asked to believe someone made the highest risk choice at every decision point, deploying sound-creating devices, doing so in a bedroom, doing so adjacent to sleeping parents, doing so when every element of basic risk assessment would scream against exactly these choices. At some point, we need to ask ourselves, does this theory actually describe what someone would do? Or does it describe what someone needs us to believe happened, constructed without full consideration of whether anyone would actually behave this way? The stun weapon theory, when examined through the lens of geographic risk, doesn't just require us to believe in improbable choices. It requires us to believe in a pattern of choices so consistently opposite to what risk assessment would dictate that the theory begins to feel less like explanation and more like misdirection, leading us away from simpler explanations that might require us to confront more uncomfortable truths about what really happened in that house during those dark hours. We've walked through the stun weapon theory, examining noise, expertise, and geographic risk. three layers of implausibility that compound upon each other until the theory strains under its own weight. What emerges isn't certainty about what didn't happen, so much as deep skepticism about what we're being asked to believe did happen. The theory requires us to set aside too much of what we know about human behavior, criminal logic, risk assessment, and the basic physics of sound in houses. It requires us to believe in a person who doesn't match any known criminal pattern, who made choices that consistently increased rather than decreased their risk of discovery, who was sophisticated in some ways but profoundly naive in others. And when we step back and ask why this theory exists, what gap it fills, what explanation it provides, we begin to see that it serves a narrative function more than an explanatory one. It gives us a mechanism for how someone unknown could have gained control. But when we examine that mechanism closely, when we ask whether it actually makes sense, we find contradictions layered upon improbabilities. Next time, we'll continue following these threads, always asking what makes sense and what requires us to believe in patterns of behavior that simply don't exist in how humans actually think and act when facing the pressures this theory requires them to have faced.